The Story of the Great Law of Peace by Peter Brooks with images from Extra History, which is available on YouTube. The story begins with a tribe known as the Onondaga. As you can see, they are in the center of 5 dashed lines. They were other tribes that lived next to the Onondaga in a place we now call upstate New York, near Lake Ontario in the United States, North America. These 5 tribes used to get along really well together. They were practically related. They spoke similar languages. They had known each other since the beginning of time. But for whatever reason, around the 11th century, they began fighting each other a lot more. And no one knows the source of why or what the cause was. There are many, many different stories. But at the center of this story is a guy named Todadado. Now, Todadado was an excellent military leader. He could win battles most of the time and fights as well, just about all of the time. Todadado enjoyed going out and conducting military campaigns, taking things, from other people through force and things like that. And Tododado's strategy was to create a kind of a violence stew. He would get people to not get along with each other, to have reasons to be angry at each other, and as soon as they started fighting, he could swoop in and take both of them. One of his greatest generals was a guy named Hiawatha. Hiawatha. Hiawatha was a great warrior, but he was also grieving. He had lost his wife and his 3 daughters. He was all alone in the world and very sad. And he thought to himself, I can't be the only person who feels sad when other people die. It's bad enough that people die from natural causes, but when we do this to each other, we make it worse. It seems that instead of war, we should try the path of peace, because the war has never led us to peace. So, Hiawatha decided to call a council meeting of all the chiefs. He made sure that Todadado would be there. He called together a meeting of all of the chiefs of his tribe, the Onondaga. At the meeting, Hiawatha explained his ideas of peace. War, he felt, had never gotten us anywhere. We should try a different path. He talked about a leader from a neighboring tribe called the Mohawk. This leader was known as the Peacemaker. The Peacemaker would take people from violence into a state of peace, and he had a very strong reputation. Yet Todadado hated that idea, the idea of peace. War was his strength. It was his identity. It was the thing that he did best. it was the way he was going to succeed. He told Hiawatha if he believed in peace, he may not even consider himself Onondaga anymore. He might as well go and live among the Mohawks if he thinks this peace and these peacemakers are so great. And that's exactly what Hiawatha did. He went among the Mohawk hoping that he would not be killed and that he would survive and get there to talk to the peacemaker. When he finally met the peacemaker, he showed him a belt made of wampum. And the design, the white beads and the purple beads, simply meant the purple beads stood for the violence and the white beads stood for the peace. And so, in that way, without even words, Hiawatha could explain to the peacemaker how we as human beings born with violence and anger and hatred can keep it contained from others in the peace through the inspiration of the wampum. Peacemaker thought this was a great idea, and he invited Hiawatha into his tribe. Hiawatha explained how he tried to get his people to peace. Peacemaker listened to Hiawatha's reasons and said to him, "It's not just you, the Onondaga, and us, the Mohawks, who should be at peace. The entire world should be at peace. These were the instructions that were left to us by our Creator. We're not supposed to fight each other like this. It doesn't make sense." He told him of a woman named Jegannzazay. Jegannzazay was known as a great cook, comforter, storyteller, things like that. All of the warriors would come to Jegannzazay's longhouse in order to be healed and entertained and to listen to the news that Jegannzazay would have. Now, what Jegannzazay would do is, when the warriors would come, even if they were from different tribes, as their headpieces show, if they ate from the same plate, by tradition, they were family members. So Jegannzazay was keeping the peace. She was doing what the peacemaker and what Hiawatha were talking about already. She was bringing the people to peace. So the peacemaker and Hiawatha went to visit Jegannzazay. They had heard about her reputation. The peacemaker showed her the wampum and how the violence was contained inside and the symbol that meant peace. Jegannzazay understood these things and made one that would symbolize the coming together of all people and keeping the peace. They went among the different tribes and explained it to them, the Great Law of Peace Thanksgiving address. And Jegannzazay would speak to the women, Hiawatha would speak to the men. The men said, "We have to have war. It's who we are. Our enemies will vanquish us if we don't have war. We'll live like not so good because people will be taking advantage of us. This made the women sad, although the women were willing to accept the peace path. The men were considering accepting it because they couldn't live without the women. But Hiawatha and Jagannzazay had pointed out to them that war was an abomination and that this was what we were talking about, how to live according to the original instructions and in a good way. And you have to do that voluntarily. We can't force you to do it. You can't do it because it's an obligation. You have to commit yourself to peace and want to peace. You have to be willing to throw away the hate in order to be happy, to be patient. And in that way, both sides agreed that they would stick to peace. So they had 3 nations that were committed to the peace, that had signed on, that would carry the wampum belt. The peacemaker decided to go back to Todadado and tell him, with Hiawatha and Jagannzazay, how he had these 3 nations and how Todadado should listen to him recite the great law of peace, Thanksgiving address, to see, what it was all about. And as he began, Todadado told him, "Get it out of here. I don't want to hear about your peace, great law of peace. If you 2 or 3 come together and decide to unite under the great law of peace, that will just make it easier for me to take all of you out in one war." He absolutely hated the idea and would not budge. So they decided to go to the Seneca, the western door. This was going to be very, very difficult because this tribe had the greatest numbers of warriors. They had the most at risk in coming to the peace because they had to deal with all of the other tribes to the west, like the Anishinaabe and the Lakota and the Blackfoot. They had to deal with the tribes in the southeast, like the Shawnee and the Cherokee, and the tribes in the south, like the Piscataway and the Lenape. It was certain that they would reject, just as Todadado had done, and not listen to the great law of peace. But when they arrived among the Seneca, Jagannzazay had already been there. The Seneca were ready to accept the great law of peace because Jagannzazay had worked with them all along and convinced them of the way of peace. This surprised the peacemaker and Hiawatha. And so it was decided that they would all sit together as a family instead of as tribes. The Seneca and the Mohawk would be the older brothers, the Cayuga and the Oneida would be the younger brothers, and they would be united together under peace, the great law of peace, a family of peace. But they still had the problem at the center of their peace, which was the Onondaga, Todadado. Hiawatha was certain that they could bring the Onondaga to peace, but the others were frightened because, Todadado had been so strong against it. The women came up with a plan. When they all went to meet with Todadado, he reiterated to them how much he did not want to hear about some great law of peace, and that having them all together like this would make it much easier for him because he could take them all out at once. But then Hiawatha spoke of the plan the women had and told him, "Exactly. That's why we're here, Todadado. We want to make you at the center of the great law of peace." Todadado was absolutely shocked. They were like, "You don't have to go to war to rule over all of us. All you have to do is listen to what we have to say." You will always be at the center of our great law of peace. Our leader shall be called Todadado from this day forward. And so, in exchange for having his name live forever in history, the great law of peace became the law of the land, just as the peacemaker had said it would, and the 5 tribes came to peace. And that peace, that great law of peace, still exists today as represented by the Thanksgiving address. Now, the way it all works is the women are responsible for everything. They are in charge. They keep the balance among the 5 tribes. The men are given titles: Nation Chief, Nation Council Representative. The titles are given to them by the women. Therefore, a man sits, he has to consider what the women that he represents wants, and this is what he presents. In fact, there are 117 do's and don'ts. Whenever the tribes need to come together, they assemble in order to have a meeting, a council. But the position of honor is reserved for the Todadado. All of the other tribes have equal power and can agree, but the Todadado still retains the veto power. He can reject even if all the others accept, but he's the only one can do that. In terms of dealing with the other neighboring tribes, they will try to recite the great law of peace 3 times. 3 times. If they do not listen, the other tribe, then they are allowed to go to war. The women still are responsible and carry the principal wampum, which is that the people will live together, containing the violence within and keeping the peace without. And in that way, the great law of peace became the law of the land in all of North America, just as the peacemaker had envisioned. He gathered Hiawatha, Tododato, and the other chiefs and explained it to them this way. If you take one arrow, it is easy to break. But if you have 5 arrows, an arrow from each of them, it is very difficult to break. This is how we must be united for peace. We must all stand up and stick together for peace amongst ourselves. And symbolically, because trees are some of the most awesome things in the universe, they planted their weapons of war against each other under a great tree of peace to symbolize the great law of peace. And in that way, the 5 tribes lived together, and the great law of peace lasted and continues on this land. To symbolize the great law of peace.